And as we acknowledge this acknowledgement is really an invitation to remain accountable to the particular histories and responsibilities of the places we are in. I'm coming to you from Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory, which is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples that affirms shared responsibility for the land and waters of the Great Lakes region. If we could go to the next slide. Again, just to review, we're going to take a moment, just do a little bit of breathing now as we've heard that land acknowledgement to arrive here. So if we could just each take a moment, feeling our feet on the ground, settling into our bodies, taking one breath in. And exhale. And another inhale. And exhale. And a final breath. And exhale. I love this practice because I feel when we do that together, we can feel that we're part of that one breathing earth. And I find it very grounding. Again, we're going to do a brief framing, learn about the toolkits, have our moderated Q&A for those who are just joining, and some time for audience questions. Next slide, please. I wanted to share very, very briefly. This comes out of my own doctoral research. Really, my question was, how do we educate for climate justice in ways that nurture meaning, purpose, and hope? And this framework is really meant to be a generative and reflexive tool, recognizing the different contexts that people are teaching within. And it's meant to be a tool that moves us in our educational responses towards the more complex decolonizing work that is so needed, really around how do we educate toward and through the complexity of transforming systems to enact climate justice. We are not just dealing with these emotions at that individual level, as we've said, to sort of just become better at coping with this reality. We are nurturing a relational resilience that enables us to work towards the transformation of systems. And so it maps this process by responding to climate injustice through relational well-being and regenerative action, while refusing the individualization of systemic harm. And one of the clearest findings from my own research, and I will put a little link for folks who later want to take a look at some of the youth activist findings. I also worked with teachers in my research, was that young people's climate emotions, their grief, their anger, fear, and numbness, these are not signs of their own fragility or fear. They're signs of their own attunement and resonance to the real and ongoing harm. And so the problem isn't that young people feel too much, it's that we haven't built the collective, relational, and systemic ways to respond responsibly to what they are feeling. And so, again, in many Indigenous knowledge systems, I want to acknowledge Diane Obed, who I think is doing really important work, here. And I just want to acknowledge you, Diane, if folks want to connect. That, again, the emotions are not something private, but they're relational. And they're signals for calling for right relationship and collective responsibility. So what we're doing here is not asking how we help young people cope better in a broken system. It's about asking how we as adults and educators and institutions learn to hold climate emotions in ways that deepen agency, sustain collective action, and do not offload systemic failure onto young people themselves. So the toolkits that we're about to hear about today matter because they respond to the real needs that educators are facing, many in very complex and deeply politicized contexts. But just as importantly, they raise ethical questions around how we're holding these tools, what responsibilities remain with adults and systems, and how we ensure that care doesn't become another form of extraction. the way that we're caring is ultimately keeping these systems in place. So I want to right now introduce Elissa Teles Muñoz, who's the programs manager for the Climate Mental Health Network. She leads the organization's K-12 education work, facilitates professional development for educators and school districts, and supports the development of practical and evidence-based social emotional learning tools. She's a background in climate justice education and also serves as the co-director of the Teach for Climate Justice project. She's an aspiring classroom teacher and is passionate about finding creative, engaging, and emotionally sound ways to bring climate change into the classroom. So Elissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Um, Thank you so much for joining our talk today. Um, just before I begin, please see a note that I sent in the chat with that we will have an audience Q&A toward the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, you can ask it in the chat, but it's best if you raise your hand and ask it during the audience Q&A. Thank you, Maria, for the wonderful introduction. As she said, I work for a group called Climate Mental Health Network, which is a non-political nonprofit that's based in the United States. Um, and we're centered on the interconnection between climate change, mental health, and education. And so I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro to climate emotions. These are slides that we often share in our presentations. So here we have this triple Venn diagram where we're looking at physical health, mental health, and community health. And these are the health impacts of climate change. And so mental health is its, kind of own circle in the Venn diagram, but we see it as extremely integral to the other components of the impacts of climate change on mental health. And climate emotions are part of it. And I just want to share a little bit of our framing and how we present how climate change impacts mental health. We talk about it predominantly in two ways, the direct and indirect impacts. So a bit about the direct impacts. This is when someone is impacted by an extreme weather event. So I'm based in New York, so these are some New York local examples. There was a wildfire in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, I believe two falls ago. There was, of course, Hurricane Sandy that occurred in 2012, where many people lost their homes or businesses or beaches, instructional time as well. The picture on the top right is a process of managed retreat, where areas that were deemed unsafe in New York coastal areas are now being reclaimed by nature, and people have been relocated and physically moved from places that they've lived for generations sometimes. And this picture to the bottom left are from the wildfires that occurred in northeastern United States and eastern Canada in 2024. And I just want to give a little bit of an anecdote. I was working with students in New York at the time when the wildfires in Canada were occurring, and the skies famously turned orange as the smoke moved southeast toward New York City. And one of the students was taking a test in her class, and she felt very disappointed because not one teacher had acknowledged that there was a climate impact happening right outside the window. And when she turned around, distracted by the orange skies, and she was wearing a mask in the classroom, the teacher said, "Eyes forward, we're taking a test." And it struck her in that moment as a high school student that she felt that the teachers were not taking a teachable moment to address a direct impact that was happening right now. So these can affect mental health because it can cause anxiety and depression. It can cause emotional strain in schools when there's a lack of instructional or there's a loss of instructional time. If students have to come to school wearing masks and or can't go outside, then there's emotional distress as well there. Not to mention when there is loss of life in extreme cases or loss of homes or land. There can also be significant emotional distress and PTSD after the direct impacts. But there's also indirect impacts of climate change. It doesn't only take being affected by an extreme weather event to experience the emotional impacts of climate change. And we refer to these as the indirect impacts. This here is a picture of doom scrolling, which is something I admittedly am guilty of. I'm sure many of us here are as well. And you can really be affected emotionally by climate change that's happening elsewhere and seeing short form videos that you might not even search on your Instagram or TikTok algorithms that just pop up that are very graphic. And this really affects children who may not have had the acknowledgement in their classrooms or homes on this topic. And it can cause a whole host of emotional issues as well. So, there was a very famous study that happened in 2023, or excuse me, 2021, about youth emotions. So, it was a survey of 10,000 youth ages 16 through 25 from 10 countries. And it found that 84% of those youth are worried or extremely worried about, or are worried about climate change, and 59% are very or extremely worried. 45% of those young people said that their worry interferes with their daily functioning, which is a clinical it's a clinical measure of depression and anxiety. And so this is really significant that 45%, almost half of those youth say that they have a clinical measure here. And then 75% of those youth said that the future is frightening. They did a study in the United States, and what we found is that there's youth worry. It mirrors the global study as well. So, I just want to say that often we hear folks talk about turning anxiety into action. And I just want to challenge that very common phrase or notion because at Climate Mental Health Network, we talk about climate emotions and action having a relationship. One variable doesn't turn into another. We need our emotions to guide our action. Um, and anyway, there's a relationship there. And so here on this bell curve, we have somebody on the left who is unengaged, somebody who is not tapped into their climate emotions, isn't engaging on the issue at all, maybe isn't aware, doesn't have education, but more likely does know and is uncomfortable and shuts down and does not want to think about it. So this is somebody who's not capable of engaging in climate action. Conversely, on the right, we might have somebody who's feeling really burnt out, who has a lot of really intense emotions happening, who feels really out of touch with their community, maybe have retreated inward, or feels a sense of of paralysis and overwhelm. Um, so we caution that having an overabundance of intense emotions and negative emotions also will hinder your ability to sustainably engage in climate action. And it's important to note that this bell curve, you can move between different points of the curve. You might not always be squarely in the center. You might move toward the right a bit if you're feeling extremely overwhelmed. The goal for educators and students and people who work with children is to be at the most, for the most time as possible in the center of this graph, where you're concerned but not overwhelmed and able to take action because you have the tools to address your emotions. Another way, another common depiction of a similar concept is the window of capacity, where you can be in hypo or hyper arousal on either end of the spectrum. If you have too much energy, it can look like anxiety or fidgeting, or, feeling the sense of discomfort where you're a little too plugged in. On the other end, too little energy where you're kind of plugged in, but just feeling a bit more apathetic. We want to be in this center area, this window of tolerance and capacity, where we're safe and engaged. So now I just want to give a brief overview of a tool that we've developed to bring these concepts to the classroom. And it's called the Climate Emotions Toolkit for Educators. It's one resource and it's free. It's free to download, but they exist as two separate documents. We have this toolkit, which is a background document for educators, which explains things like the neurobiology of climate emotions, a bit on climate justice, how to engage your students in action, etc. And then these are classroom activities that are in the United States. We have the Next Generation Science Standards, or NGSS. So they're NGSS aligned and also aligned to social emotional learning standards and competencies. So yeah, this is a bit about our organization. and who we are. So this background guide for teachers, it can be used for educators as well, parents, anybody who wants to learn a bit more about this topic in depth. And the activity guide, as I said, has 10 engaging lesson plans, as well as 4 mindfulness meditation videos designed specifically for teachers who are going to talk about climate change in the classroom. It's important to note that these are not climate change curricular resources. These are to be used to support the teaching of climate change in the classroom. We did a study in 2023 with middle school teachers across the United States to learn about what the barriers are and what kind of emotions they're seeing in the classroom. 72% of those teachers said that their students had expressed worry related to having experienced an extreme weather event directly. 82% of the teachers said that they experienced worry when teaching about climate change. And 83% of those teachers were concerned that climate change would harm the mental health and well-being of their students. So to test this resource, or after the study, we developed the resource. To test it, we did a national pilot with 40 teachers in 25 states across the United States. We were very intentional about where we were testing it. We tested it in many states that have climate education mandates or legislation or statewide policy. We tried to have a representative geographic distribution as well by not only testing in suburban or urban areas, we also made a significant effort to test this in rural areas as well as the political orientation of the community, trying to get an even spread. What we saw was a significant change in teacher confidence versus before versus after using the resource in addressing their students' emotions. And yeah, I'll send the toolkit in the chat after the presentation. You can scan the QR code or visit our website to check it out. Like I said, it's free to download. We just want to bring this resource to the classroom so that teachers can segue between the teaching of climate change, addressing emotions so that the students can broaden their window of capacity and tolerance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elissa. I'm going to introduce you now to Laureline Simon. She is the founder and director of One Resilient Earth. It is a nonprofit organization that's based in Germany and offers transformative learning to young people and engaged professionals so as to foster climate resilience in regenerative ways. Before founding One Resilient Earth in 2020, Laureline coordinated international cooperation initiatives focusing on climate change mitigation and adaptation. This included supporting international negotiations on climate adaptation, loss, and damage, and the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform with the UN Climate Change Secretariat. She also led an international research program on climate adaptation in cities of the Global South with the French Development Agency and worked on disaster risk reduction with SIWA, a women-led grassroots and organization in India. So turning it over to you, Laureline, to hear about the Clarity Toolkit.
Thank you so much, Maria, and very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to tell you a bit more about the Clarity Project, which has led to the production of a toolbox for teachers and educators, as well as a teacher's guide. If you want to move to the next slide, I want to highlight that the Clarity Project is actually born out of a cooperation between different European project partners. It's part of an Erasmus Plus project. And I'm happy to see that some of the representatives of our partner organizations, like Lotten from Legacy 17 and Bernie from the IIE from Lund University, are here with us. So we are basically 6 different partner organizations, because Luxus and IIE are both at Lund University, based in Sweden, Hungary, Norway, and Germany, who have come together to develop this toolbox. Next slide. So the purpose of the Clarity Toolbox is not to focus only on the emotional resilience of the students. It is a core dimension of the toolbox, but it's really about building the students' competencies to grow climate resilience in transformative and regenerative ways. So in the toolbox, we're addressing 5 core competence areas, as we name them. The first one is taking care of climate emotions and trauma, but we also introduce tools that are about nurturing connection with oneself, others, and nature, embracing values that sustain the lives of all living beings, opening up to diverse, climate resilient, and regenerative futures, and taking collective action for climate resilience, ecosystem regeneration, and societal transformation. So the idea is to provide tools that can complement one another, can work together in order to help students learn new skills that are relevant when living in a world where the climate is changing, and in order for them to be able to take action at the roots of the climate and ecological crisis. Next slide. So in terms of learning resources, we have a teacher's guide so that the teachers have all they need to know about climate resilience, climate emotions, trauma-informed and transformative approaches to learning before they use the toolbox. It felt important to highlight that some of those topics are quite new to teachers and they may need a bit more background information so that they have a good understanding of how to use the tools in the toolbox and understand how the tools relate to a certain vision of a world that is more climate resilient, more just, more biodiverse. Then we have the toolbox in itself, which includes 21 tools. And for each tools, we have different activities that can help implement the tools. We have so many activities because our toolbox is actually reaching children and youth according to a pretty wide age range. So going from 6 to 26 years old. So we try to develop activities that would respond to the needs of this audience in different ways. And some activities are actually easier to implement than others. So providing a bit of flexibility for the teachers working with those tools. We also have a self-paced online course and an online community so that in order to support you as a teacher in using the toolbox, you can take the self-paced online course and you have recorded educational videos, extra learning resources, and a community to ask questions so that you feel fully supported in implementing the tools. And as an organization, One Resilient Earth has also been offering a teacher's training, which is more like interactive workshops to go even deeper into the use of those tools. Next slide. So we've had the chance of testing the tools during a pilot phase as well, where we had about 50 teachers, and they reached about 1,000 students in different countries, in about 7 European countries. I mean, at least that's where we got the data from. And that has enabled us to see that the tools were impactful both for the students and for the teachers. Next slide. So that in terms of students, I mean, 83% of the younger students, 6 to 11 years old, responded that the activities helped them to deal with climate anxiety. For the older students, like university students, answered that the activities helped them to deal with climate anxiety for 86% of them. So those are the 1,000 students that took part in the surveys. And we also got good feedback from educators who took part in the training, who had to rate, certain variables from like 0 to 10. And in the before and after surveys, we saw that teachers would take better care of their emotional and mental well-being when addressing climate issues. They would support collective actions even more so as to tackle climate change and its impacts. And they felt better equipped to build their own resilience and that of others to the impacts of climate change. And we had a 100% rate of recommendation of the resources for all the teachers and educators. And if you move to the next slides, where you're also invited to check the resources on the Clarity website. They're also free to download. And you can also search the toolbox so that you can find, exactly the tools that work for you, depending on the age of your students and what you're looking for. And I'll put the link in the chat so that you can also just click on it if you want to.
Thank you so much, Laureline, for the presentation of the toolkit, and Elissa. So you have a sense of these two different resources and programs and ways that the issues of climate emotions can start to be addressed in educational contexts. And, again, this is something that as the climate crisis intensifies, I think education systems are really needing to consider, and educators are really starting to take seriously and needing that support to do this work, because especially because climate change has been so politicized that, to actually address student well-being around these issues really does require some resourcing and support and communities of practice in so many ways. I just want to say as well that there was a group of us that came together with the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, and to support, the toolkit that Elissa mentioned. There's also an educators toolkit that was developed by an ad hoc committee of educators, social workers, and psychologists that I think bring also pedagogical ideas forward and more ideas forward to, really again help educators make some thoughtful decisions. I'm going to ask Elissa and Laureline to respond to just a couple of questions, and then we will turn it over to you for your questions. But I want to ask, what is it that you are noticing, whether in classrooms, in communities, your conversations with educators or youth movements, that you think made it clear that existing approaches to climate education or mental health were insufficient? What was it that was missing that led to the emergence of your approaches? And I think I'll start with Elissa, if you want to share your thoughts on this.
Well, as I shared a bit about, I can also send the link to our research study that we did. Um, it was clear that teachers felt that there was a barrier in the United States context, because this was done in the United States, that there was a barrier to engaging their students in climate change education to begin with. But those that did also felt that there was a significant barrier in addressing student emotions, and that they didn't feel confident or prepared to bridge their student emotions and their students' emotions. And we also learned that they themselves didn't know how to address their own emotions, which is why we created the toolkit with background for the educator about emotions in general, that includes pieces about student emotions, but also tools to support their own emotions. Um, we often talk about it as a mask that you put on, an oxygen mask in the airplane, that you put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. Um, and so it's still kind of a question of how can we help teachers and educators who are bringing a kind of existential topic to the classroom, and feel that the fact that it is existential is a barrier in and of itself. How do we help them feel confident enough to do that, and to say to their students, "Hey, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I do know, and here's what we can do in our classroom."
Thank you, Elissa. Laureline.
Yeah, and I think at the very start of this project was the fact that we were organizing a lot of climate circles, so spaces for young people to come and talk about how they felt about climate change. And there was this massive distress that was being expressed, especially from students who were generally studying sustainability topics. So there was this very strong realization that the more you know, basically, about the climate crisis, the more distressed you tend to be, which is corroborated by different research that shows that climate scientists are usually pretty high on climate anxiety. And we were also running learning journeys for young people in parallel as an organization, where we would provide emotional care and emotional support. And many participants were also students, and we never had something like that in our university. Like, it would be so good if we had some climate psychologists, or if we had some grounding exercises, some breathing exercises. What you're providing basically in your own learning spaces, we don't have it. And coupled with the fact that we've had requests from ever younger people to join our climate circles, where we didn't necessarily feel equipped, to work with teenagers. It opened up this question of like, how come the way we teach about climate change tends to increase, climate anxiety. And how come the teachers are not trained to address that massive public health issue and mental health issue? And so it led us to contacting other partners. We're also working with teachers. We're also schools to check, if anything was being done, if they were seeing teachers having needs there, and that was the start of the research at the beginning of the project, and seeing that there was an actual need that needed to be addressed in Europe with the teachers and educators.
Thank you so much. One of the things I found in my research with youth activists was what they said really clearly to me is they were not their own climate emotions were not at all relieved when the solutions that were provided whenever these issues were being addressed in classrooms were things like bringing a reusable water bottle or recycling, that they actually felt that this increased their anxiety because they knew categorically that these responses were not adequate to respond, and they felt in ways that minimization, that moral injury really of seeing leadership and adults not taking these issues seriously made it worse. And so what they said clearly is that it was through collective action and collective movement building and collective systems change, those pathways actually offered the greatest support for their mental health and well-being in the context of the crisis. And so, when we're thinking about these resources, they exist to support young people. And at the same time, they don't absolve governments or institutions or adults of that responsibility. So how do your frameworks help educators ensure that systemic failures aren't being subtly offloaded onto young people under the banner of resilience and well-being, where young people, the other side is that young people feel this incredible burden to sort of take on the weight of the world and solve these problems. So Laureline, I'm going to start with you if that's okay on this one.
Yes. I think we start with just accepting that it is the situation at the moment. Like a lot of the responsibility of dealing with the climate crisis is being offloaded on young people, and that it creates a lot of stress and a lot of overwhelm. So the resources are meant first to limit the suffering, I would say, and to acknowledge that this is the situation, to validate the additional emotions that come with this feeling of overwhelm and frustration and betrayal, and to give them tools to be able to better navigate those climate emotions. Now, the toolbox in itself is designed in such a way that it doesn't stop, at the emotional part, or that it includes other dimensions that are about, reframing the values that we have, rethinking how we relate to the future and taking actions collectively. So we could say we're still equipping the young people. What about the adults around them? What about their work? I think we make it quite clear in the introduction to the toolbox that it's not the responsibility of young people alone, and that we should be careful of not expecting young people to be heroes in that situation, that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done by the older generations. And I think we also highlight the importance for young people to work on the more transformative solutions, which hopefully have a lot of co-benefits in the sense that it's about exploring desirable futures that would be more exciting. It's about working with ecosystem regeneration. So it goes beyond the more limited climate mitigation actions to work at this deeper level. And giving the young people both the authorization and the tools to focus on those deeper actions, while the adults, take care of the mess more urgently, I would say.
Thank you. I love in terms of what you're saying, like those regenerative actions and thinking of, the possible futures. And really, we can see this as well as healing work. It's the work of making ourselves, our communities more whole, of coming back into right relationship. And that, really does increase our well-being as we think about that this world needs healing, right? It needs deep healing of systems that have caused tremendous harm, and how we invite ourselves, young people, our communities into this deeper healing work. Elissa, how about you? How would you respond to the question about, not putting everything on young people, but ensuring that responsibility stays, with adults and institutions and systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely my personal belief and the belief of Climate Mental Health Network as well. I think when we're talking about an education system like the one in the United States, especially, I also should have mentioned earlier that these are resources designed for middle school students. So, age appropriateness and content appropriateness was really important to us as we were developing this, as was, is this a resource that all 50 states can use in a way that doesn't alienate based on, um, we wanted to keep it aligned to national middle school standards. And so um, there are subliminal ways that we included this message of, um, you know, this. There are ways that we included this message of this is a societal undertaking. Like we have an activity, it's called Climate Change Solutions and You, and it asks students to kind of ripple and expand their thinking in what is the work that needs to be done that you can do and that your society can do, and that what's work that needs to be done on the global scale, which are ways of thinking that are appropriate for a middle schooler. Um, so I think that I hope this answers your question. But yeah, I think that we also ask students to interrogate their or investigate their relationship with nature, which is, something that maybe students don't take the time to do by themselves naturally. But if they have an assignment that says, okay, chart out your path, and when was the first time that you remember engaging with nature? These are ways of thinking that we can eventually lead students to understanding, like replacing your reusable water bottle isn't the place to start. The place to start is to consider this relationality in a way that's age appropriate.
Thank you so much. What you're saying, it reminds me, um, you know, one of my teachers who's had such a huge impact is Gahandakwas Diane Longboat. She's a Haudenosaunee knowledge keeper, ceremonial leader, and really a true leader in so many ways. Definitely advised our own regional government here in Canada around, um, really honoring and distinct Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous students in this context. And she talks about, when we're thinking about that developmental stage and age appropriateness, and she says, children have to fall in love with creation in order to want to rise up to protect it. And that one of these big responsibilities to first, it's love. It's our love that is going to fuel the action that's needed, that we love, the bird song. And so we rise up to protect, and that we love our community. And, it's through that love that this work comes in. How do we don't talk about love in education, and yet love is this medicine and fuel for this work that needs to be done. And so it does get us to think about how our education system, the sort of ontologies or paradigms that it's grounded in to start with, that lead us towards this separability, when really it's love. I mean, it's love that I think has brought you all here, right, today to talk about climate emotions, and there's care and empathy and compassion and concern. And this is the resource that is so powerful. So I'm gonna invite the audience, but one thing I just wanted to sort of bring forward, just as an idea, is in this work around social emotional learning, a sort of a caution, because it does focus on interpersonal skills, and absolutely it matters, but it is coming back to how we're thinking about this framing of the climate emotions, that what we're really trying to do when we're nurturing more of that emotional literacy is not to stop it at emotional literacy as the goal, but the emotional literacy in support of these more relational capacities, ways of being in relationship with uncertainty right now, for example, ways of being in relationship to loss. There is loss. We have now baked in enough carbon that there's grief. We need to learn and come together and grieve. There are losses that we're already facing. We're in relationship to collective struggle right now, and we're in relationship to more than human futures and what's happening. So it's to keep moving as we think about this work of the climate emotions, not to keep them at that individual level, but that we keep seeing them as we're nurturing literacy to come back into relationship, to help us be in relationship to a lot of really complex and challenging things right now. And we will not optimize ourselves as individuals to be able to move through this. This is a collective struggle. It is filled with grief. It is filled with love. It is filled with rising up with our spirits, to do this work of systems change. So I want to thank Laureline and Elissa for this work that they're doing to really, at that practical, grounded way, start this work that really needs to happen to support youth well-being in the context of this crisis. And I want to open it up here to the audience if you have questions that you want to bring forward in just the last 10 minutes that we're together. Thank you, Dominic. I'm looking at your thoughts. Yes, Ada or Ada, I'm not sure, but I'm going to say Ada and you can correct me.
Ada.
Ada.
Hi, thank you for this session. I was already familiar with Laureline's work, and congratulations on the Clarity Project. I've been waiting for the toolkit to come up for for some time now, and I've checked it out, and it's quite an impressive work. I'm very glad we are finally bringing emotions into the conversation that has been taken place for such a long time on this very intellectual, science-based data, facts register. And I am wondering, it's a bit more technical if you want, because working with schools in Romania, I tend to notice that lately it is more and more difficult for us to ask of teachers who function in the public system to apply this kind of activities in their classrooms in a formal or non-formal way. So in the teachers who were involved in your two projects, Elissa and Laureline, in which kind of context did they find the time and to carry out these kind of activities in a systematic way? Because I bet one single workshop or one single activity won't change much. I would say you would have to go to do something throughout the year to get the students engaged in order to build these kind of competencies that we want them to have in the end. So was it in school? Was it in clubs? Was it in what kind of social context or educational context?
I can respond to this first. So as I mentioned earlier, we did a pilot, and so that's the most comprehensive data that we have about how teachers were using it. Most teachers were using it in the classroom after teaching about climate change in whatever way. They were all teachers of all subject areas. So if they were teaching about the carbon cycle in a science class, for example, then they would use one of these lessons to supplement. Another thing about our lessons is that they can stand alone. They can take an entire class period, or most of them can take between 15 to 20 minutes if you just want to get the tail end of it. So many teachers did it this way, where they taught a lesson and then they use this to support the lesson. I do know of a teacher who did this with her gardening club, because these were students who didn't learn about climate change in school at all. Like, they were students who where their climate literacy competencies weren't almost non-existent. And so she was kind of bringing them the education in an informal way through their gardening club. And then they would use our activities to be like, wow, that was a lot. Now let's check in so that everybody can go on about their days and feel emotionally attuned.
Yeah, and in our case, I think the groups that implemented the activities was the most thoroughly, or like was the most diversity, were definitely universities where they were already working on sustainability issues. So it was they could integrate it because the whole program was, essentially about sustainability and climate change. We also had some schools that have very like alternative pedagogies and that are much more focused on relationship to nature. So it was also easier for them to implement. The difficulty you're pointing out is real. I think like a lot of teachers working in, the public school system, it's going to be much more work for them to find the time, to find a way to integrate it. But as Elissa highlighted, and which is a similarity with our own toolbox, we also have activities that take different amounts of time. We've got different ways of implementing them. And so we hope that over time, they may start with like the simpler or the shorter activities, see how it resonates, see if they can generate more space in their schools and more support to integrate more. So it's also an integration that we believe will take time, but hopefully it's a longer term movement that we're starting with those toolboxes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question, Ada. And I do think, again, like what it's really pointing out to, like what we're seeing, and maybe something we can explore, together in these last few minutes that we have, is there does need to be a deep ontological and philosophical paradigm shift within education. It cannot continue. This cannot be an add-on subject. I really see that educational sites have to become sites for regenerative futures. I mean, the scale and scope of the crisis is so profound that anything else is really completely inadequate. And so as we're doing this work of like starting these pathways with the toolkits, it really is about a larger systemic transformation of education. I'm going to put in the chat as well, in case folks are interested in reading. My own doctoral research really asks this question about how do we nurture meaning, purpose, and hope and teach toward climate justice. And it really is looking at these three movements that I think are really important that we keep in mind. That one aspect of our educational approaches have to be critiquing dominant culture and ideology, critiquing the oppressive systems, critiquing what has brought us to this moment. How is it that the fossil fuel executives knew in the 1950s that, we would be here, and they proceeded nonetheless? What kind of education system produces that kind of decision making? We have to be pointing toward alternative possible futures as well, that social imaginaries, and not foreclosing. But we also within education need to be practicing these different ways of being, really moving into how do we support students to develop those multi-species relationships, to come back into relation, to actually put on the table that peace and love and compassion matter, and that we're going to teach and create systems and educational experiences that practice these things and do these things. So really, we're talking about, three movements that are needed for this kind of transformation. So I want to, if there isn't another question, I'll just give them. Is there another question? I have something to sort of end with to ask Elissa and Laureline to respond to, but I wanted to still keep the audience. If there's a question that you have that's really pressing for you, to sort of leave it to you. Okay, so the question I have is really looking ahead. So let's be being future oriented ourselves. What is it you hope educators will no longer need from these toolkits because the broader conditions for climate education and collective action have changed? And I don't know, Laureline, would you like to start here with this one?
Sure.
You have 1 minute. 1 minute each.
I wish we no longer have to convince educators that the emotional and mental well-being of the students is important, and that it is their role to take care of the students, not just to impart knowledge that can harm them without caring about the consequences. So, and that they are in a position to do it, that it is just something that they can learn to do. So that would be my take.
Thank you. And Elissa.
And on my end, I wish that educators will have robust climate knowledge, pre-service and throughout their teaching time so that they can feel confident to bring the topic to the classroom, that they have their own climate literacy competency so that they can bring it. And I think that we're making progress in that area. There's a lot of groups in the United States, at least, that I know of that are offering professional learning, as well as us and other mental health groups that are offering professional learning on climate topics and micro-credential courses. So I hope to see that path continue.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank both of you for the important work that you and your organizations are doing. This is so needed. It's such a needed area. We're seeing that the evidence continues to show actually that youth mental health is continuing to decline, because of all of these issues. And it absolutely is something that needs to be addressed within education. And I also want to thank all of you for coming today, and also again to recognize that we are part of a collective of movement building that is about protecting life, present and future generations. And despite whatever nuances and differences that we have in our context, that I think it's really helpful that we recognize the urgency of this moment, the existential nature of this moment, and to continue to connect our own relationality, right? Our own relationships, that even coming together today, we have, put something forward that we don't know the seeds that continue to plant as we think about this deeper systems change work, not individualized work, but that deeper systems change work that we're all a part of. So really want to thank you all. And for folks who are interested in practicing some regenerative ways of being, I'm going to put a link to Anayennisi, where it's an experimental space for folks who might be interested in that work. Again, Elissa and Laureline, thank you for the work that you and your organizations are doing. And we're wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day, your evening, your afternoon. And yes, and to be well during these very, very complex times, and to continue to rise up and take action. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.